our studies 2 years after. So I got some slides on that. And Wim is going to reflect on those kinds of findings, and that should ideally lead into a discussion with you about what's next for the STIR. I mean, this is also part of the reason why we are here. This set of STIR studies is coming to an end, but possibly a new set of studies will emerge. So what should we think about at that point? So just very briefly, this is kind of the background. I did one study in Delft at the Department of Biotechnology in the autumn of 2008. And the second study was at the Center for Bioenergy and Photosynthesis, which is led by Wim in the winter-spring of 2009. So, Wim, could you say a little bit about your lab?
Yeah, so it is a rather interdisciplinary process that we are trying to research and eventually apply. But the funny thing is that most of the people in my lab are bio people. We have essentially no engineers, even though by the end of people's dissertation, depending on the work that they are actually doing, they have been exposed a lot to engineers. They have really become part of the group that goes all the way from molecular biology to sort of applied in larger scale types of things. So what is being done, we're working with a cyanobacterium, and that is being modified in ways that it can utilize sunlight and CO2 as it does in its natural photosynthesis process, and rather than just making food for itself, it secretes fatty acids. It can't do anything with those fatty acids. They go out of the cell, and then you essentially get these get converted into alkanes by decarboxylation of the fatty acids, and what you get out is essentially a fuel. So it's that whole process, and we are doing the molecular biology part, but you know, it's a rather interdisciplinary kind of thing. So it also involves synthetic biology of sorts, however you want to define that, and all the questions that come with that. And then in the larger scale, you have to think about GMO microbes in the environment. You have to think about land and water use. And these are kind of implicit. We don't really have a course or anything that they get exposed to that, but it comes up in lab meetings, comes up in just thinking about the process as a lab. So fatty acids is just one of the things. You can also do a whole lot of other aspects of biofuels or synthetic chemicals that currently come from oil. So anyway, that was just the sort of intro to set the stage for what the lab is doing.
Thank you, Wim. So these are some pictures. Actually, they're from Delft and Tempe, but they kind of indicate the work that we've all been doing, all the STIR researchers have been doing, which Eric has described as extended ethnography. So in a sense, it's lab study observation, lab observation, but feeding back what you find in real time back into the system. So this is the extended part. Well, yeah, I got to say it's big fun to do it actually, and very interesting. Just as a background, these studies were part of a PhD research on social responsibility in research practice. So I tried to use midstream modulation to answer a set of earlier questions. So the question was, to what extent can I use midstream modulation to render the broader socio-ethical dimensions of research visible in the lab, first of all? So can we make these things a part of the discussion? As Wim said, a lot of this is implicit. And the second question, do research participants, when you engage them in such discussions, consider such critical reflection on these broader issues to be at all relevant? So, and I'm going to breeze through these couple of slides. It's just to show that Eric showed this picture yesterday, and it's a protocol that we've all been working with. But this is what it looks like in reality, and this is just one kind of minor decision that would, 10 or 15 of those were taken every day. And you can unpack each of these into these different 4 categories and see what are actually the kind of alternatives considered, outcomes, what are the considerations for working on this type of decision. That leads to kind of my kind of representation. So each block represents one kind of protocol sheet, and then I bring that back, and then they say, no, you got it all wrong. You forgot about the whole photosystem 1 thing that I'm doing. And so these are the scribbles of my research participants. Then I go back and turn it into something neat. So this is kind of the line of research. And interesting for me are the little red. You can't read this. It doesn't really matter what the kind of, but these are the things where broader socio-ethical dimensions become visible all of a sudden. So that's about the protocol. Then I wanted to kind of interpret these findings. Okay, so what happened? And what I used is a model from Van der Poel and Zwart from Delft University, and they are actually collating several categorizations of reflective learning, and they divide between first-order reflective learning, which takes place within the boundaries of a value system and within background theories, and you could describe that as the improvement of the technology and the improved achievement of one's own interest in the network, and second-order reflective learning, by which the background theories and the values of the research system as a whole become the object of learning. So this is reflection on the research system. And basically, I found instances of both during the lab studies. And I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm just going to pick a couple of examples, but just to give you an idea, there was a lot about research planning. Just talking about your research and putting it into this schedule gives the PhD an idea of, how much they got on their plate and the decisions they need to make. And for most of them, this was not something they were used to doing. There were efficiency considerations. Well, couldn't you make a bigger batch, a smaller batch? Why do you heat it to that far, et cetera, et cetera? Lots of those. Because we're working on day-to-day decisions, those are the things you're going to find often, of course. But also relations with colleagues, so how do I kind of position myself within the lab? And a bunch of socio-ethical issues at the micro level. So think about environmental health and safety issues, responsible conduct of research, etc. But also the second-order reflective learning, in which we talked about the ethical, legal, social dimensions of genetic engineering as a whole. Or the whole idea, the whole complex relation between science and policy, and the social relevance of research, which I'll say a little bit more about in the next slides. And even, Eric asked me to remind you that I'm a philosopher, so one of my interests were about the underdeterminacy of data. So they would get this big machine, and they would do some work on it, and then I would ask, okay, so but how do you know that actually that figure is correct, right? Well, that's how we always did it. That's how we always done it, and it always ends up with an 8. If it's a 7, it's wrong. If it's an 8, it's okay. Okay, but what does that 8 tell you? So those kinds of discussions going on a regular basis. Let me have a look at the time. Yeah, so I'm gonna skip this one, I think, in view of the time. It's an interesting example. It's about environmental health and safety considerations. I observed the lab workings, fed that back into the group, saying, well, this is what I've seen. And what came out of it is that sparked quite a hefty discussion. So I think it's an interesting example because you see that my presence somehow evoked some kind of latent consideration about environmental health and safety issues. So that's an interesting finding. On the other end, it's extremely micro level because it's like 2 people in one lab taking the decision to wear a lab coat. So you may wonder whether this is actually the kind of the size of the scale of things that you want to address. I would like to spend a little bit more time about one instance of second-order reflection, so reflection on the research system as a whole, and this concerned the idea of social relevance of research. So basically, in my we also did pre and post interviews, so one at the beginning, one at the end. And I always ask the question, does society benefit from research? And the typical responses that I would get from everybody basically is, yes, sure, of course. One of the main goals is that society benefits from any research. It's not just a fun thing we're doing here. And another one, yeah, I wouldn't see what would be the point otherwise if it would help the rest. If that's the reason, then usually society should benefit. What should be the point otherwise? So there is this big concern for science somehow serving society. If I would then ask them, does society benefit from your particular research project, the answers would become less obvious. So C1A says, I hope so. It's not my immediate goal. I haven't thought much about it. What I'm doing is basic research. This is probably a little bit far away. What I'm doing is probably too far. And R1A says, well, honestly, I'm not sure how I can help. This is more basic science, fundamental science. So we've been talking about this over dinner, Wim and I. What's the meaning of this discrepancy between kind of the general purpose of research and the specific purpose of research projects? And I think what we kind of arrived at is that definitely the first slide shows that social relevance ought to be important. There is this awareness that this is a societally important aspect, but we're not sure how to get there. And what Wim and I then discussed is maybe this is a shift. Maybe we could see this as a shift that we now experience. Also, the things that Roop was talking about yesterday. Students now begin stating that this is a motivation for doing research. So they're doing research to address fundamental problems of our time. And actually, we have a video of 17 seconds from one of the research participants that we could see as representative of that shift. Or not. I mean, I invite you to kind of comment on that once you've seen the. At any rate, this could be a cue for socio-technical collaborations, and this comes back, I think, to the mandate of the 21st Century Nano R&D Act. Okay. Yeah. So, just very generally, this is the conclusion from my thesis. Midstream modulation was found to engender fruitful and meaningful collaboration between social and natural scientists, encouraging second-order reflective learning while respecting the lived morality of research practitioners. Not only did it make broader socio-ethical issues visible in the lab, it also encouraged research participants to critically reflect on these broader issues. Well, great. The evidence backed it up. All nice. Finished my paper, defended my thesis. Good. But now, 2 years after, I thought, let's ask the research participants what they remember and if at all this changed their research practice. And again, a positive confirmation of what happened is from one research participant who says that I think there is a big advantage in having an objective opinion in the lab. I think most of us have good ethics, but I think that we could use some social help. So there's a lot of interesting details in this, but at least there is a confirmation that this could be useful. But then I asked, have our interactions changed anything in the way you think about or do your work in the lab? And the response was, they probably changed for a while, but without reinforcement, I probably lost some of those good working habits. The project has become so demanding, and so my focus turns to having the job done. Not just the molecular biology part, but also supporting roles like setting up growth chambers, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, he's just too busy to kind of remember all the stuff that we've been talking about. And Wim actually had the same observation. So maybe you could...
Yeah. So when Dan was in the lab, then I kept myself at a distance. You know, that was the right thing to do, have them interact. And I saw that going on from a distance. Then I thought, okay, let's just see how this works in the longer term. How do those students, and two of them are graduating now, two of them are still away, say a year away from that, how are they evolving? Are they different than any of the others before, in a sense? Of course, there is a difference now that the work has become much more applied. We used to do much more basic research than now, but it was an interesting thing to just observe. Did those changes that Dan sort of encouraged, did they stick? And the bottom line is, when the changes were really part of their motivation of why they were doing research, why they were doing the project, then yes, it stuck. When these were things that were just another thing to do, and yeah, okay, that made sense, it was better, probably, but wasn't really their motivation of why they were doing it, it went by the wayside. I think that's the bottom line of what we have been seeing. So the students, at least 2 of the group of 4, their motivation of doing this was all these listings of sustainability related work that they were interested in. And you know, they then also overall are thinking about GMO microbes, risks and benefits, etc. But their main motivation was sustainability for two of them. And that still drives the students' motivation for those 2. But then when, for example, you know, whether they should be wearing a lab coat or not, or whatever they should do with ethidium bromide or what have you, as long as it is within the rules of the university, they don't really worry too much about, yeah, okay, should I be wearing that lab coat, yes or no? Well, they don't really care. And from me, in those cases, there's not much encouragement one way or the other than telling them, be responsible. Think about, does this make sense for you? Is this a safety issue? And if it isn't really a safety issue, then you can go either way. Lab education, to a large extent, is learning to make those decisions for yourself and not just following the rules because somebody tells you, okay, this is what you must do, and one half of the things you must do, the other half you may not do, and you have no choice. The students must develop their own choices in these things. So, I think one of the things that also came out for me is that students have the tendency, if they become too interdisciplinary, to spread themselves too thin, and then they realize that at some point they go like, oh, yeah, I have too much on my plate, I can't do it all, and then they say, oh, I need to focus, and I usually, sit down with them every week or so, saying, okay, is this working? Are you going the right way here? And then usually they realize for themselves if they are spreading themselves too thin, and they kind of focus, and then that usually means that they become less interdisciplinary than they were. That's the trade-off that you have to make. So, bottom line, I think it made a lot of impact. Dan was there, students thought about stuff, but really to make a lasting impact, it needs to be part of their chemistry. It needs to be part of them, right? If they are really interested in these things, yes, then it does. If it's their second priority, it gets displaced. One of the interesting things that I think at some points, from my perspective, STIR might want to think about in the next phases is, would it make sense to, at least at ASU or at other places, have some seminars that bring together students from the natural sciences and the political sciences thinking about some of the broader impacts. I think that's going to be something that many students are going to be having passion for. And I'm not saying it should be a weekly thing, but get them together at the workshop every couple of months or something for a morning or an afternoon. Have them interact well and have question each other's values on why you're doing it this or that way, or why is it that's an important thing for you. We don't have that on the books in the curriculum. We don't require that for any of the granting agencies. Bioethics courses are required by NIH, but this kind of interactions are not required, but at least in my mind would be very useful for a large number of students. One place where that might be useful is the broader impacts from NSF. Being a reviewer of those, okay, they are nice, but they are not directed towards the students, right? They are sort of broader impacts of what you are doing as a lab, but it barely ever filters down to grad student education or what exactly you do there. There would be an important place to develop, perhaps. And I think there is as much that the social or political scientists can learn from the natural scientists as the other way around. It needs to be a two-way street, particularly, for example, in the GMO world, GMO microbes at a larger scale outside. Some people have major problems with that. Then we have to see what are those major problems, what's the worst case scenario, and in many other fields there are many other questions to be asked. And with that, I think Dan is next.
Yeah, for my final slide, I think. Let me have a look at the... Yep. Well, just to follow up on Wim's point, I think I will end with this kind of slogan. We have been stirring for some time, which I think was brilliant, and we've learned a lot, and it was very much in the research area. And I would say we'd have to move on to let it stew for some time to do some socio-technically embedded work. And by that I mean not that we didn't do any work in the research, but I think one of the things we'll have to do, and of course we need to stick to the research as well, because there's been a load of questions that that still have big scholarly interest, so to say. But I think if we want to have 100 or 1,000 labs interested in what we do here and invite us in, we'd have to get out of research and into application mode as well. And I think, again, coming back to Roop's inspiring talk from yesterday, I think the scope of the challenge that we actually wanted to tackle also with STIR may be too large to focus only on the lab. So I'd say training and education, as Wim also indicated, and the institutionalization somehow of broader reflection would also have to be part of that second kind of wave of studies. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan and Wim. Eric asked me to make a very short statement on the institutional interest we could have in this type of exercises. In order to save time, I'll wrap this also in a question, so we can then open the floor. I actually wanted to start where Dan ended, namely, we have to go into application mode, and this brings me directly to my comment and our institutional interest in this. Perhaps, I don't know how it goes with NSF, for instance, but in the European Commission evaluation of research proposals, all those research which is, let's say, societal sensitive in nature is subject to an ethics review. and this ethics review is rather broad in nature. It can involve all kinds of topics, and this is left open to an independent group of scientific experts. About 60% of those proposals which we receive are actually reviewed by an ethics panel and also changed because of this review. So it has an immediately impact on, well, in other words, the research proposal has to be rewritten. So one way of, and I think this is our common interest in topics such as those, that we would like to see a sort of early societal intervention in research. So one moment to do that is prior to the research starts. You could also think of that actually social scientists and natural scientists would actually work together already in writing a research proposal. So this before you enter into the lab. So that's one phase. This is actually practiced. Now, the interest of midstream modulation is that you could argue, as we all know, that once you have submitted a research proposal and you actually do research, that the longer the research takes, the farther away you go away from your original research proposal. I mean, this is not uncommon. If you anticipate results A and you find results B, then for a natural scientist this is obviously not a problem, because if you write an article for Nature, you report on your results B and you rewrite your research agenda as if you always anticipated result B. I mean, this is fine. Now I come to my question. The interesting thing, of course, is that with this midstream modulation, you could think of, I mentioned the first intervention prior to research. Now you could think of that this type of modulation would also lead to an intervention on the research agenda while doing research. Now, what we have seen yesterday and what I've now seen for you, we really didn't came to that point of saying, well, the research agenda as such was modified because of this intervention. I think, though, the potential is there. I think in Daan's case, and I mean rightly so from his perspective, because he wanted to do something on social relevance and social responsibility from his thesis point of view, I understand that there was some emphasis on morality, and Wim had some emphasis on, let's say, the individual learning impact of researchers, also over the longer term, but not so much on the research in itself. So it's a question for you to see what you think. Is this now indeed a potential to change the research agenda while research is on its course, beyond just the moral aspect, so to speak? So much more in terms of research priorities, and it's a question for everybody, actually, for the whole idea of using this midstream modulation as a way of intervening in research agendas, which would actually also be my interest. So that's all I have to say. Open the floor for further discussion. Maybe you want to have an initial response, Dan? Or?
Yeah, well, I think this is where the upstream links with the midstream, and I think one of the things, Eric can probably say this better than I can, but one of the objectives of STIR was to see what we can complement to what is already going on at the upstream, at the midstream level. So yes, and I think there are opportunities, but we also consciously chose to work with PhDs. And then I think the impact on research agendas would be harder to kind of, because the PhD just needs to do that part of research, right? So it will be interesting to move midstream modulation slightly upstream and do the same kind of things with, say, lab directors, or and see what they. But I'd like to open up the floor to discussion. Maybe other people have completely different insights on this.
I think one of the things that that I struggle with is showing the value, sort of the longer term, and potentially where you'll see that happen is in, is in as these people who have participated with us go out and do their own research. And so I think it's more of maybe a generational thing that's going to have time versus something that we can directly say, okay, even 2 years afterwards, was there a change, and was there a change in the research agenda out of it? So it may be, and it'll feed into mine about institutions and how do you change institutions, because the institutional change is what really makes ultimately the behavior change stick.
And also, let's not forget that STIR was explicitly a research project. So I think we've been very consciously holding back on the idea to influence agendas, because the idea was, what happens when we get in there? If we are too strong in thinking we know where we want to end up, this is not a research project anymore. I think that would be interesting in the next wave, but this was explicitly not a part of the STIR project in itself. So I think that's important to mention. But yeah, the institutional dimension is huge, and I think that's also where you cannot. That's also the claim that you cannot just stick into the laboratory, and you have to integrate with activities and measures at broader upstream and downstream levels, I think.
There was a call from the floor in the back.
James Sang for Professor Vermaas. Have any students in your department, when they graduated, actually gone off and formed a company, or are there? And what is the state of biotech startups in your area?
They haven't necessarily founded a company, but when you'll see where students go, it's about 60–70% research in academia or government, national labs, etc., and about 30–40% private industry. But that oftentimes involves, initially at least, joining larger companies. There is not that much of an entrepreneurial spirit that has gotten through at the graduate level yet. I think at the ASU student population, the entrepreneurial spirit is more at the undergrad level. You see more encouragement there than, hey, go out with your graduate student idea and form a company. It gets into a lot of IP and IP issues. ASU usually holds the IP on whatever gets discovered there, either by a grad student or a postdoc or a faculty member. So yeah, it's, there are still issues there to be worked out over time.
Biotech in the area, in the tech area?
Yeah, it's not the strongest area, but it's not the San Diego or Boston type of deal. But there is some companies there. Yeah.
Thank you. I really like Renee's question, and I'll suggest that there are 3 levels at which midstream modulation and STIR-type integrative activities can impact the research agenda, or rather how that relationship can manifest. One is a very explicit, formal rewriting of the physical document or the electronic document, right, where you can imagine the National Institutes of Health do this sometimes, where there's a change in direction, but it has to be proposed and conceived and given the green light, and then there's actually language is rewritten. That's one way in which these relationships can be attended to. Another is just more in, I think, what Don was attempting to do, and that is notice changes in the agenda, developments in the agenda, and make these conscious in the group. And I'll say that in my work with Roop in his laboratory, one of the things that was pretty astounding was that the graduate students didn't realize that they were actually influencing agendas all the time. They were reshaping and shaping the research direction as it was occurring. They were also providing ideas for future proposals. Even if they were writing text that got uptaken into the proposals, it never occurred to them that they had a hand in influencing research agendas. So just making it conscious and just sort of recognizing on an individual and on a group level that the direction is changing, we are performing the direction, is work that others have done. Shannon Connolly is sort of attending to this in the notion of a social contract, what the contract is. It's not necessarily written out formally, but it's something that's agreed to. And another stirrer who couldn't be here, Federica Lucevero, is focusing on visions, and she just did some work at ASU in which she realized a research group had 2 different visions over a several-year period. They were still using one vision to do work that was related to a second vision. She fed this back, and the research director said, yeah, I think maybe we should revision what we're doing here. So whether it's actually formal or collectively acknowledged, I think this is work that can be done and is being done. And I'll just also highlight Anthony Stavrianakis' work in terms of asking for the justification of research. The justification can change. The question is, what is your account of it? We should probably move on. Yes.
So indeed, we have consumed 30 minutes, so the floor is now for. Now I'm of course less professional in pronouncing the second couple of names. I'll try. Antonio Calleja Lopez and Shreya Bhattacharya.
We have people from physics, chemistry, engineering, all different kinds of backgrounds, and also, of course, we work with social scientists.
I think that one of the things that I wanted to mention, which is the matter of the context of my collaboration, at least how the ASU and concretely also the lab that I was working with was relevant before, during my study, and also after it. And I think that the first thing here was how I was received by the people in there, and how, although there was unclear what the matter of this collaboration or what, let's say, the final outcome would be, they were, let's say, open to give the time that required.
Well, there's one thing I'd like to mention here when Antonio speaks of rewards. When we started working with social scientists, we did not really see how this would reward us as a scientist. And I think that was a natural concern for everybody, because it was like, okay, I'm giving my time, I am sitting down and having a conversation with you, what do I get in return? And I think one of the ways to overcome that would be if a social scientist actually did some work in the lab. And I don't mean a thesis or like a whole, experiment, but how about helping me make my buffer or something like that? And that way you understand what day-to-day science is. You understand what the frustrations are, what the technicality it involves, because day-to-day science is kind of very repetitive. We're not making groundbreaking discoveries every day. It's not about breakthroughs. It's about doing the same thing over and over again. And I think this is something that both a natural scientist and a social scientist can gain from, is actual hands-on experience. And so, like, for example, Antonio made STM tips, which was something I needed to be done. And so I felt good about sitting down with him and, having conversations with him and giving him my time in return.
I think that was a relevant thing to try to overcome, in part, like the typical system of rewards that is based in papers and patents. And I think that we got a little bit around that with different things like collaboration, like within the laboratory. I think that the matter for me in this study was, of course, something that Shannon mentioned yesterday, which is the matter of language. I am still struggling with my English, and I think that didn't help me to especially at the beginning, to get what was, like the jargon within the lab. And I think that was a relevant thing in the beginning. And for instance, that was something relevant at ASU, not unlike in Madrid, where I think that the main issue was the matter of what I would consider like discipline, in the sense of how the researchers consider, or what the researchers consider to be possible in an interaction with somebody who is not from one's own discipline. And I think that against what could be expected, like language or culture being a relevant thing, I think that this matter of what was the let's say the environment of the laboratory and also the institution was very relevant in my interactions. I found that was as a factor of the influence in the collaborations. And as an example of that, in Madrid, where there was no previous experience of this kind of thing, I actually had to rely much more on the personality of the individual rather than, let's say, in the ambient in which the collaborations were taking place. And for example, at the ASU, I got much more, let's say, homogeneity in the kinds of interactions that I was able to undertake. And I think that's let's say, an example of the relevance of the context on the type of collaboration that is possible. Now, beyond the conditions of this type of collaboration, I wanted to bring like 3 different examples of how this collaboration took place. This is one of that I usually like to comment on, because it exemplifies different, let's say, what can be a reflexive moment within a conversation and what can come out of that. During let's say, a conversation about how they do build the solar cells that they were working on, the practitioner was explaining me more or less which were the different parts that the solar cell is composed of, that you can see on the lower left corner of the slide. And as he was putting me like the different elements that they use for doing that, I suggested him to a little bit like explain me where does he think that politics and responsibility are involved in this process. He told me that essentially is in the moment of what kind of research is funded. I then suggested why not to try to think about the different groups that are involved in trying to build each of those layers of the cell. And as he was explaining me that, I was asking him, okay, so where do you think that politics or responsibility is involved in this process? And he would go on pointing out the picture and saying, well, it is here, it is also here and here. And at a certain moment, as a form of recapitulation, I asked him again, like, where is then politics or responsibility in this context? And he says, well, politics is everywhere. And I want to use that quotation as a starting point for the matter of how is responsibility articulated in a context of contemporary science. And I think that my 2 studies in Madrid and Tempe were complementary in the sense that while in Madrid, one of the highlights of the year was the development of a new way of synthesizing fullerenes, which are essentially like molecules with 60 carbon atoms. In Tempe, they were actually using fullerenes to get a certain polymers to improve their solar cells. Although you can see very easily the causal and the material connections that could relate those 2 sides, the question of the goals and the telos of the operations were clearly disconnected. Yet, when I talk a number of times about these kind of issues with the researchers that have to do with the question of how you articulate responsibility in let's say, in a practice where division of labor is so strongly articulated, I had 2 different, at least, I had several takings. I want to emphasize 2 of them. And one had to do with a more classical approach to this, that responsibility in science has to do with getting good data in the sense of trying to achieve, let's say, something that is reliable. And at the same time, I found concern about the question of how certain, the characterization of these systems in nanoscience and nanotechnology right now, there is certain difficulties given let's say, the innovative character of the activity, the conditions of the system and the methods that they are using, and at the same time how the expectations from their activities are, let's say, or they understood to be higher than it should be given the research right now. And I'm not saying that this is let's say, like an objective diagnostic, but was a feeling, and that brought about the question of how you can be responsible for what you do. And they would stress the different ways in which they were trying to do what they what they thought that needed to be done with respect to their work. And also another issue in this sense that relates what is expected or what is requested, and also how many practitioners feel about those requests, and it has to do with especially with the, let's say, like the promises or expectations about a certain kind about the research. And I thought that there were a number of times emerged the questions of how the calls for social impact weren't really felt at the level of where they were working, and some of them would talk about not a certain lack of actual honesty in what they were saying that should be expected from their work. And I just put this forward as one possible taking of how a responsibility can be articulated by practitioners, or is articulated by practitioners. A second one occurred during a conversation with a co-PI in Spain, and had to do essentially with how they were going to try to scale up this process of synthesizing fullerenes, and how they were going to use different types of catalysts and size of particles in order to try to optimize the operation under industrial conditions. During this conversation, the matter of toxicity popped up, and the normal position of the practitioner was, or the researcher in this case, was to say, well, I mean, most of the elements that we are going to use, most of the substances are inert. At that point, I tried to feed back essentially some of his arguments about how the use of, for instance, the example of that he uses to bring about, to exemplify how nanotechnology implies a number of new phenomena. For instance, with the case of gold, how a string of gold atoms has very different properties that you would expect at the macro scale. And I basically asked, well, if you really don't know at this level what could happen, don't you think, I mean, I basically posed the question of whether this question of unknowability could be a problem, and also, therefore, the question of toxicity. And well, I mean, basically, in the post-test, I got a reference to these kind of questions, like something that need to be done by their group. And this happened at the same time that they were actually preparing the project for the next 3 years. So I'm expecting or waiting for that project to come out to see if there was some form of interaction, and in that sense, if there was some form of what Eric was mentioning in terms of rewriting of the project in the long term. I think that's real.
Well, yeah, I would like to make 2 points over here. So first of all, and I'm saying this as a graduate student, when I come into grad school, we have people from all different cultures. Typically in my lab, we have people from India, China, Europe, South America, all different cultures. And when we go into a lab as graduate students, just because we have such different backgrounds, not all of us are aware of bioethics, or like, for example, me, I've never ever taken a class in bioethics, or say the philosophy behind science, or things like that. And it's not like a graduate student is trying to not wear their lab coat, for example, but they're just not aware of it. And by interacting with social scientists who are telling us on different levels, like, you know, this is something that you need to do. We are being made aware of it constantly. And that awareness gets instilled in us and in our minds and in our systems. And then when I train another student, I tell them, hey, you know, you need to wear your lab coat, or you need to keep this in mind, or you need to think of the disposal of waste, or you need to think of the toxicity of these chemicals and stuff like that. And so that is, I think that is something that was really important. And the other thing was, so initially, again, as a grad student, it's difficult to assess the benefits and the drawbacks of a program like this, like why should I interact with social scientists? But I got involved into it because it was more like a lab culture, because my advisor, Stuart Lindsay, is so actively involved with social scientists, and hence I became involved. And gradually, as I got more familiar with the process, I started assessing the benefits of myself. And then every week when we would sit and have our conversations, Antonio would make the chart and would kind of like present the whole picture in front of me. And I found that very helpful to organize my own thoughts, because as a grad student, I get caught up in the little technical details and my experiments, and get sidetracked and everything. So it helped me organize my thoughts. And the questions that he would ask, like, is this good for the environment, or do you have a greener solution? Is there a greener alternative to the chemical that you're using? And in most of the cases, the answer would be no, there's not, and this is what I'm going to use because this is good for my thesis. But he would say that those questions set off a thought process in my head, like, can I use something else? And that is what science is all about. It's about creating the thought process. And as you think, you start to realize, okay, there may be an alternative. Maybe there is an option, and maybe I will instill that in my next experiment. And try, maybe make an attempt, and I think that is really important, and that's how this project affected me personally.
Yeah, just as a little conclusion, since I have been commented on a number of times the matter of the context, I think that, Shreya and other people that were actually involved in this project have been afterwards strengthening their correlations with CNS and ASU, et cetera, and I think that that's relevant, especially in comparison with Madrid, where most of it will be a matter of personality and personal relations. While at the ASU, I left like 1 year ago, and there is still things going on that I believe are related to this kind of interactions. So this was like something that I like to hear about, and that I think could be relevant in terms of how to move forward this kind of thing in the long term. So thank you very much, and let's open the time for questions.
Thank you. Okay, let's open the floor for discussion. Who can I give the floor? See a hand right in the back.
Hey, Mike Gorman from National Science Foundation. Hi, Antonio.
Hi, Mike.
You said something about making STM tips. So did you actually do some hands-on work?
Yep.
Excellent. That's actually all I wanted to know. Thanks. We can talk more about that later. I'm interested in the phenomenon of not just doing the...
That proves that I'm still working with my English.
There you go.
Thank you. Rosemary Ulmer from the University of Victoria. I'd like to ask Shreya. Antonio said that there was a language difficulty for him when he came into the lab because the science language is specialized. I want to ask you, did you have a language difficulty? Because social scientists use jargon all the time as well, and are often unaware that they're actually putting up barriers instead of getting comprehension.
Well, I think Antonio was really good about that. He'd really dumbed things down for me, which helped me get involved. But then when I did take classes, well, I took only one class in like a science and society class, and there, of course, I had, there were barriers. I mean, I couldn't understand a whole lot of things. And that is perfectly acceptable, because if a social scientist was to sit in on a physics class, there would be a lot of barriers there as well. But it wasn't something that would make me not interact with social scientists. It was something that intrigued me, rather.
Thank you. I would like to, if I may, take the opportunity to plead that we understand what jargon is for. It's a way to talk among ourselves. In our particular code, it saves time, it cuts corners. And it's very useful. If you're an economist talking to other economists, you can talk about a Pareto curve and everybody knows what you mean right away. But if you're an economist talking to a natural scientist and you do that, it's not fair. And I would like to make from this, for interdisciplinarity, a general plea to social scientists that we watch our jargon, because it's not helpful when simpler language will serve the purpose. Communication among ourselves, a sociologist to a sociologist, a physicist to a physicist, it's fine. But a sociologist to a physicist, we can use different languages. An accessible language is one of the big keys to successful interdisciplinarity. Thank you.
Hi, Shreya. We heard from Dan's thing earlier about, and Wim's about the effects. We were looking at the effects of this integration on the long-term kind of thing, and that there was some backward movement. But you're in a different position now. You get to move forward. You get to take this experience into your career and everything. And I'm wondering how you may be thinking about doing this. You already said that you are teaching those behind you, but now you're going to be moving into your career, potentially into leadership positions. What lessons have you learned, and what kinds of things do you think that the community around you can help you do to keep this movement in your own career and to continue being maybe a role model for this kind of thinking going into, this reflexive thinking, this thing about thinking about the broader impacts?
Well, I think that it's very important that you continue doing what you have already started, because it's really good and it's very beneficial. And I know that you face a lot of resistance from scientists, but then again, as I said, it's hard for a graduate student who can only think about like my experiment and my this and my thesis. It's hard for a graduate student to see immediately what benefits there are to something like this. But I don't know, maybe as a scientist, if someone goes and tells them, for example, when my PI told me, hey, you know, this is something that you should do, it's good for you. And I was like, okay, I'll do it. And then I got to see for myself what the benefits were. So something like that, someone to tell them that, okay, I think you should get involved and make them involved and just get them to know more and make them more aware, and then they can train others. Because when I'm setting up like labs or experiments at my work right now, that is always there on my mind. Am I following the rules correctly? Am I always wearing my lab coat? And I don't have to find that out the hard way. Like I don't get holes in my clothes and then realize, oh yes, I really need a lab coat. So that's something that's really important. And I think getting people involved more and more by continuing what you're doing right now is a great option.
And I think that's part of the difficulty, and this is more of a commentary to, I guess, the whole group, in addition to you, in terms of, I think it's this idea of consistency and reinforcement. One of the things that occurred to me is you're going now in the job market. And whether or not you would be asked questions by potential employers about how you were trained to think about broader impacts. Is that question even an interview thought? I mean, when you're hiring people, do you even ask that question? About the kinds of training, the kinds of things, you know, how have you thought about your research in terms of broader impacts? How are we training you to even answer that question in an interview? Have we, you know, train you how to tell that story about that line of thinking? And, you know, so it's to me, it sounds like, you know, the leadership culture. You mentioned Stuart, and he was very, you used that word culture, the lab culture that he set up, which is very telling for me. And other people may not, you know, have had not that kind of experience. So I guess that's more of a rhetorical kind of question about, you know, where are those other places that we're training people and thinking about it? And if we're asking people to think this way, again, like even in the interview process, you know.
Well, I would like to comment here that later my employers told me that this was one thing that stood out, that the fact that I was involved and I had participated in something like that, because when people go into the job market, everybody's a scientist. Everybody has a particular set of skills. They know, I mean, you know, if you're going into the job market, you know how to do an experiment and you know how to do this and you know how to do that. Every scientist knows how to do that. But they said that, well, the fact that you are involved and you have gone to a museum and done demonstrations and stuff like that, that is something that was really interesting about you, which kind of made you stand apart. So that's something you might want to tell the graduate students, that, you know, it gives you a little edge and sets you apart from the rest.
Hi, Anders Johnson from the Norwegian Research Council. I would like to ask both Antonio and Tria more specifically about the relationship that the social scientists and you as a natural scientist have. Do you feel like that relationship is balanced? Do you feel like there's like a mutual kind of exchange of trying out a different role, going out on a limb to try to understand the different perspectives, trying to learn from each other? Or do you feel like you were researched on, or were you researching with?
You first.
Well, initially it was just an interview. He was asking me questions and I was answering, but then gradually it kind of changed, and then I became more involved with CISBO, and at that point I would ask him for advice on what to read, what books to read, what courses to take, and how to go about this whole thing. So it wasn't like it was always balanced, but there was places where I was speaking like a scientist, and then there was times when he was acting like a social scientist, but ultimately it kind of became really balanced.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is, as she was mentioning, I think it depending on the moment. I mean, if you understand that by balance, some sort of meta balance, in the sense that there are different moments in which one or the other takes the lead, then yes, then it was, at least I saw that way, and I tried, and I think that we both tried to be, for it to be that way. So,
And then just a follow-up question to Antonio. So you're the social scientist or humanist. Did you feel like during this process that you were actually able to self-reflect on your preconceived notions about your research? And then did that change during that process?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things I didn't mention that was, at the very early with respect to my own practice as a philosopher, especially because, most of my background comes from philosophy, is that, well, in philosophy, you usually, work with arguments or discussion and books and things like that. And I felt much more closer to them even from the beginning, just to work in the lab, but also even just setting timetables, getting them enrolled, because at the beginning, it's never easy. As I was mentioning, the question of time at the beginning was a matter of concern. And yeah, that brought me out of books, for instance, in that sense. And in many other ways, I mean, I try to keep this talk, let's say, in a more, more narrative way, but I have been doing some work with respect to the method and what that implies also in terms of self-reflexivity, using, different references and that kind of. So yes, I mean, it really made me think, not only because I was already willing to do that, but also because it forced me to do that. So the very situation forced me to do that in ways that I would never have expected it to happen.
Morning. Just a quick comment on, or a brief disagreement on the point about jargon. It was very important to me in Basel that, for instance, I knew and understood what a ribosome binding site was. That was very important for me to be able to actually get into the project and to know what's happening. Synthetic biology, just as one example, some people in synthetic biology are inventing a new language in order to be able to try and do work in a different manner, which involves sort of, let's say, word, referent, and concept, so a conceptual language in order to work on biology in a different way. And I think so too, the social sciences require a better, newer language in order to work on these problems, some of which we've been talking about today. And I think the pushback against jargon is also a pushback against specificity. So sometimes the pushback against jargon can lead us to a level of generality, which makes it actually very difficult to specify the problems we're interested in. That's my opinion. So I just wanted to briefly disagree on that.
So, Anthony, I was thinking in terms of, well, I mean, maybe we can discuss on this later, okay? Yeah.
Can I ask a question? I'm Qinzhu from Dali University of Technology in China. I'm also very interested in the topic of language in the laboratory. There are some of the conceptions are shared by both of the natural and social languages, like safety. And for engineers and scientists, they have their own understanding about safety, like they have the safety, science, and engineering. And for social scientists, we have the public understanding of safety, or even for humanities, we have also kind of understanding of safety. So my question here is, have both of you had some discussions about such kind of conceptions which shared by both of the two fields? Or with the midstream modulation, have both of you got some improvement within those processes in understanding these kind of conceptions? Furthermore, do you think, especially for Antonio, we have such kind of the linkage between two kind of languages? Like, can you imagine we have such this kind of socio-technical language for our research? Thanks.
Well, I mean, I think that partially that was what Farsad was commenting yesterday. If you understand language as something that is only spoken, yes, I think that there is ways in which we share, let's say, a number of terms that sometimes do not mean the same, and that you have actually to clarify in different ways. And then there is a matter of the language of concepts. And I think that in that way that this kind of interaction helped me to maybe to get closer to some of the ways in which they understand. Like yesterday we were mentioning the question of the principle of precaution and how to articulate many of things that I had in my own language, either like spoken or conceptual, and bring it to bear into the kind of questions that their concepts and their language bring forward when there is an object at the stake, or there is a situation that needs to be let's say, thought about, which is partially related with what Anthony was talking about, the matter of how in certain fields they even try to articulate a new kind of language. And I was wondering even whether if we also need a new kind of language for certain situations, whether this is a process that can become somehow co-shaped or like co-emerging in that sense. So yes, I mean, I think that there is ways in which there is like convergence with respect to language that we are communicating with.
As for the safety issue, I'd like to comment that my attitude towards safety has changed a little bit after interacting with CISPO. Initially, I would follow the rules myself. I know how to dispose of waste. I know how to protect myself, but I wouldn't necessarily tell another person, hey, you're not doing this correctly. But I feel like, especially after interacting with them, I feel like it's necessary to point it out, because initially my attitude was, well, I'm an adult, he's an adult, he or she, whatever, is an adult, and I mean, if they're not following the protocols, well, whatever, too bad for them. But my attitude has changed a little bit, and I can be like, maybe you should think about it, maybe you should think about proper waste disposal and stuff like that. So that's something that I've noticed as a shift in my attitude towards safety.
Can I just say something about that? Terry Wilkins from University of Leeds. I think that's a sort of university attitude problem. In industry, that would be totally unforgivable. You are licensed to alert your colleagues they're doing something that's unhelpful to them and unhelpful to their colleagues. So, and I must say, coming from industry late into university, it's been very difficult to persuade researchers to follow the same rules, but we do try and keep up on them all the time at that, because in our university we have Europe's leading academic centre for nanoparticle design and scale-up and synthesis. So we just cannot afford to take the chances. But you're right, it's a good thing to do.
Thank you. A break is foreseen 10 minutes after 10, coffee break. Maybe we can take one additional more question and then go for break.
Hello, my name is Hua Tian. I'm the visiting scholar at the CISPO. I've got two questions. One is for I'm sorry, I cannot remember your names, I'm sorry, but I've got a question for the gentleman there. And right, okay, it's a project. I can see from the screen, and suppose it's not a project. Do you think you can work in the laboratory, in the industry? I mean, the industry labs. Can you work?
Whether I would be able, in what sense? In that I would be allowed to work, or that I
allowed to work?
I mean, to do this kind of thing. Or rather
so that's the question. I know it's a project, right? Now you got the permission to get access to the labs in the universities at ASU, but do you think you got the possibilities to work in the industrial labs, work with the scientists or engineers in industry labs? That's my question for you.
I would say that, for instance, that was one of the matter, the mention to the context is that in Spain, I actually tried at least with like 6 different groups, and only like 2 of them were more or less positive to the matter. So even within university or more, like a public context is more difficult depending on where you are trying to go in. And I think that some people here, right, actually work with.
I was in a biotech.
Yeah.
Also, Francois Thoreau spent 3 months in a very large multinational research laboratory. And I think there are 2 other examples, and we just got 3 letters last week inviting us in, all from national, private laboratories. But that's an interesting topic, and if we can't treat it now, maybe Terry and some others might want to just comment on some of the differences between university and private labs.
Yeah. So another question is for the lady. Right, so it's a project, and you are the scientist or trained scientist for the future. And do you think you are, I'm sure you are going to take the job in the future, and do you think you will work continually with the social scientists working with you, or in your lab, or in your private time?
Well, I kind of have taken a job, and I am working right now with them, so.
So, I mean, in the future, are you going to follow this procedure?
Well, in my free time, definitely, and that's what I've been talking to Brenda about, where like she goes to museums and does demonstrations, and that's something that I really enjoyed. I've been there just once, but I really enjoyed it, and then that's something that I would like to do if they would let me to. So,
Thank
yeah,
you.
definitely, I'd like to be involved.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, we can go for coffee break and see you back in 10 minutes.